Amen. All right, well, we'll start a little bit easier. Gentle side of the pool here, but you recall Mark in two halves. We were just alluding to this, the authority of Jesus' person, now the authority of his office as Messiah, prophet, priest, and king. And right now we're exploring the character of the kingdom, which is organized around three occasions when Jesus predicts the passion. We've looked at the first of those. It really highlights the broad idea of the kingdom that in this place, suffering precedes glory. The disciples wanted it the other way around. They wanted to go straight for the glory, you know. They wanted to immediately find themselves in the prestige positions in the kingdom they were sure Jesus would establish in Jerusalem, and Jesus has to slow them down. That there is, before that Via Gloria, the Via Dolorosa, the Messiah himself must suffer. You will suffer with me. If you want to be my disciple, take your cross, follow me. And that, of course, is for all of us as well, to realize that part of the process of living in this kingdom is submitting to the suffering that may in fact be part of it. Very realistic. This is not, a sales pitch. Jesus isn't trying to bait and switch folks, bring them in on some pretense. He wants to be right up front. This is what you're bargaining for if you're going to participate. Well, in that broader context, we have a somewhat more practical application of it now in the second prediction, which begins to explain that part of this suffering that we're describing is simply adopting a state of mind that one would call humility, that leads us to a proper attitude towards service. The kingdom is a place of serving, humbly serving, which usually means serving those who are not the high and the mighty, the prestigious, the people who can pay us back for our labors in their behalf. This is service for the least of these. There's no quid pro quo here. I'm serving those for whom there's no reasonable expectation of repayment. Those who are the obscure, the folks that are on the fringes. That's been the calling card of the Christian movement from day one, that we are looking for folks who are in pain and who are needing help, and we're reaching out to them. And part of our own taking up the cross is a other-centered ethic that leads us to the doorstep of folks who never thought we'd be showing up to give them a hand, but that's what Christians do. And so Jesus wants us to realize that that's what's going on in this kingdom. It's a place of humble service, and it was all triggered by a little dispute the disciples were having over who's the greatest. They're coming down the road from Caesarea Philippi to Capernaum. They think they're out of earshot, and they're squabbling. Who's the biggest cheese? Who's going to have the premier spot? Who's going to be the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare? Who's going to have this? And that's what they're worried about. Who's going to be the VP? Only be the VM, the Vice Messiah. Who's going to be right there? And Jesus, of course, hears all of that. What were you guys disputing about on the road? They're embarrassed like kids caught in the act. And then Jesus says, you want to be first in the kingdom, it's fine, it's okay. But here's what first looks like. And this introduces this notion of humility and service. Well, John just can't quite abide that. Look, Jesus, there's got to be a limit to this serving the least of these business. I mean, for example, just the other day, we saw some guy out there casting demons out in your name. We told him to stop. That was the right thing to do, wasn't it? And Jesus takes our breath away. Hey, don't stop him. If that guy is not openly opposing us, you consider him a teammate. His theology may be rudimentary. He may not be able to, dot every I and cross every T in his confessional understanding, but if he's not an open, hostile enemy of the movement that I am starting here, then you welcome him as a friend, in spite of what seems to be the evidence of his more rudimentary or lesser status. But that's balanced now by this that I'm calling the rule of rectitude. There is a limit, but it's not the limit that John was thinking of. It's a different limit. It's a limit that looks inside my own heart. And Jesus introduces it then with these words: whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to stumble, it'd be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were thrown into the sea. Probably the toddler, maybe Peter's own child, is still sitting there on Jesus' knee. The little ones, Jesus may have pointed at him. But of course, implied in what he's saying is also the folks that John was alluding to. Little ones who may be out there serving in a way that we think is beneath what ought to be true, qualified Christian service. Those to whom we may have a kind of disparaging attitude, a dismissive assessment of their significance in the kingdom. Those who we as good Presbyterians think, well, they just quite haven't made it yet, you know. And Jesus, of course, is extending this rule to them as well, that any of these are to be the recipients of our respectful appreciation. These are the ones that we may be tempted to silence, as John was silencing a guy throwing a demon out in the name of Jesus. But Jesus says, even that person believes in me. There are degrees of faith, as you know. We think of that guy who said, I believe, help my unbelief. We're all there to some degree. Some folks have the most simple, two-dimensional faith, just the barest understanding. The woman who comes just reaching out to touch Jesus, the hem of his garment. We don't attribute to her great profound faith. As far as we know, this was just virtually bordering on superstition. But she thinks, if I could just touch his garment, I'll be healed. And yet even that faith is worthy, you see, of Jesus' positive response. And when we're surrounded by folks, if they're not openly hostile to Christ, if in any sense at all they're serving under, the banner that is waving with his name on it, then we should be having this kind of attitude toward them. So these little ones need affirmation, not condemnation, lest we injure their faith. And now Jesus kind of shocks us with the probably hyperbole of his language when he says, look, if you start running around impairing, impeding, criticizing, nitpicking, carping at those who seem to be trying to serve me, but may not be doing it in a way that meets your high level, you'd be better off if we tied a millstone around your neck, and that's one of those huge millstones still used in parts of the world. You can only move it by donkey power, You can't pick that thing up. It'd be better, Jesus says, if we tied one of those around your neck and threw you into the sea. And that even is worse, because from the Jewish point of view, the sea was the abyss, that place of awful dread, that almost haunted, deep. They could hardly imagine a more gruesome prospect. That's how seriously Jesus takes it if we're tripping up anybody who is doing anything for the cause of Christ, even if we have deep disagreements with their belief system otherwise, or have some kind of dispute with them over other matters. We should finally be, in the final analysis, cheerleaders for them, much more than critics of them. Well, Jesus continues, not letting up the pressure, but actually ramping up the intensity of this. He says, if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. It's better for you to enter life maimed than having two hands go to hell into the fire that shall never be quenched. Now we see a dramatic change between verse 42 and 43. 42, we're still looking at those out there, little ones, others, people casting out demons in Jesus' name who don't seem to be with us. As broad as that net may go, those are the kind of people that are in verse 42. But now you notice verse 43, the focus changes abruptly, and Jesus starts talking about your hand, your foot, your eye, a shift from my concern about others to my concern about myself. And this in itself would have been somewhat shocking to the disciples. Again, they were steeped in their Jewish tradition. And in the Jewish tradition, in the Old Testament, people who were impaired, amputees, or others who were disabled, were excluded from the assembly. Case in point, Deuteronomy 23, others are available if you want to hunt them down. He who is emasculated by crushing or mutilation shall not enter the assembly of the Lord. Priests who might be blind in one eye or have some kind of paralysis or impairment were not permitted to act as priests. Lambs that were going to be offered had to be without blemish. There was a kind of code in the Old Testament that only those could come into the proximity of God who were otherwise healthy and whole, you see. That was the expectation. Now, it doesn't mean that these folks who were mutilated were lost, but the assembly was an official body in the Old Testament, otherwise called the congregation, which had a decision-making authority. It was the broadest element of democracy under the Hebrew economy, and anybody who was impaired in some significant way was not permitted to be in the assembly. That was the simple concept. And so there was an idea that the source of your pride was your physical wholeness. You see, that's the point. 2 good hands, 2 good feet, 2 good eyes, and I have the right to get into the inner circle, as it were. But if I'm impaired, crippled, diseased, blind, or otherwise suffering from some disability, that becomes a restrictive rule. And here Jesus says, put yourself under the category of those restricted in order to actually gain access. It's exactly the opposite of what they would have thought of. The thing in which I took my pride becomes, in fact, my greatest impediment. If my 2 good hands are causing me to sin in a kind of prideful arrogance towards somebody I think is of a lesser status than I, you better get rid of that hand, you see. It's a very sharp kind of statement, but it has that sort of ironic subtlety to it that I think is often missed. What's causing me to sin? If I'm criticizing somebody for casting demons out in the name of Jesus, because that person is not, as I estimate it, with us, then the question here really on the table is, what is actually, really, truly at the heart of that criticism that I'm rendering? I mean, am I really concerned about the glory of God? Or is something else going on? That's what Jesus wants us to tackle, and it takes a bit of ruthless honesty with oneself to go inside and find what's really happening at the level of my motives. Matthew gives us an interesting illustration of this, describing the religious leaders. Pilate answered them, saying, "Do you want me to release to you the King of the Jews?" Because Pilate knew that it was envy that had caused the chief priests and scribes to hand Jesus over. Pilate was smart enough to know what was going on. He's a politician. He gets it. Here are these scribes, Pharisees. They want Jesus to be crucified. Now, they're not going to walk right up to Pilate and say, "Now look, Pilate, we don't like this guy because he's showing us up. He's so much better than we are that all the people are rallying to him. And that's really offending us, and we'd like you to get rid of him so that we can be restored to our prestige position in the community. Because all the folks like him better than us." They're not going to say that. It's like some kid in the classroom who breaks the curve. Don't you hate those people? You know? Marilyn Jackson. I love her. We went kindergarten through 12th grade together. But she always did better than I did. I remember in the first grade, this is the truth. Little self-disclosure here. I was trying to color some drums. My teacher brings Marilyn Jackson's coloring project. It's beautiful. You look at mine, I was a first grader, I could see the difference. And that seething resentment was already there. Those curve breakers. Well, that's what Jesus, he comes to do. He comes to Jerusalem, he's coloring inside the lines. His righteousness so far exceeds the pretentious righteousness of the Pharisees that they are all being shown up to the point that they are seething in resentment. So what do they say to Pilate? They say, look, we think this guy's a threat to your authority. We think he wants to overthrow Caesar. They give all these bogus excuses. Pilate knew better. He knew. He knew the motives. Well, we have to be a little bit of a Pilate when we start looking inside our own heart. What's really going on here? What was John's real motive when he went out there trying to silence somebody, trying to stop somebody because he was not with us? What's my motive? Anytime I find myself being a little critical, especially towards somebody who is otherwise laboring in some sense or other under the name of Christ, if I find myself being critical of that person, I better watch out. Because Jesus attaches this alarming peril about being thrown into hell. And he never says things like that to the folks who are the notorious sinners. You don't hear Jesus talk like that concerning the prostitutes, the tax collectors, all those people that are just obviously so bad. No. It's always the religious, conceited folks who are the recipients of this kind of warning. That's us, folks, at least potentially. And this is the warning that Jesus, I think, wants us to take seriously. What's my motive? Well, Jesus' counsel is if I find in my heart something of that envy, something of that conceit, something of that critical attitude toward others who are in this great big tent that we call the kingdom, then the best thing I could do is go in there with a scalpel and start getting rid of things. It's the language of sharp hyperbole. It does represent the practical application of what Matthew gives us. Mark doesn't give us this language, but it's the same principle. If you are not with me, you are against me. I have to ask myself the question, am I really with Christ? You know, I love teaching Sunday school. But you are so kind, so generous, so appreciative, I have to constantly beat up my ego because you keep filling me with all this sunshine. What is motivating me to teach Sunday school? What is motivating you to serve in whatever places you're serving in this place and elsewhere? We have to ask ourselves that deep question. And if I find out that actually something other than truly standing with Jesus is what's going on, and it often does kind of worm its way into our motives, Jesus says, go in there with a scalpel and get rid of that. Some of you know the name Arthur Wellesley, better known as the Duke of Wellington. He was the guy that, of course, took a commission with the British Army to go out and meet Napoleon, and actually ultimately defeated him at the Battle of Waterloo. But before he took that commission, he was well known as a master musician. And people would come to hear him play, but astonishingly, when he was given the commission, he took that beloved violin of his and smashed it. People couldn't believe it. And he, a Christian man, said, no man can serve two masters. He didn't want to go out into training, out into leadership, out into the battlefield and still be thinking about his next violin concert. He didn't want to be going back to his tent at night and practicing up, running through a few. He had to be single-minded. You see, violin playing is not a bad thing, it's a good thing. It's a wonderful thing. But it can be so wonderful that it competes with my real purpose. If my two hands, my two good feet, my two good eyes are actually become the fuel for my ego, competing with my allegiance to Christ, then I'm better off getting rid of those hands and feet and eyes, you see. That's how radical and deep is the call to discipleship. And that's what Jesus lays on these guys. Otherwise, they are in peril, he says, of going to, and the word is translated here, hell. The Greek word is ge'enon. The two epsilons you see in the first part of that are not a diphthong, they're pronounced separately, ge'enon. We facilitate English pronunciation by sticking an H between it, so you've heard Gehenna, and that's the word. It was, at least by tradition, the city dump outside Jerusalem. That's been disputed, and in fact it's a fairly late source that gives us that, but it does seem to be based on at least a fairly reasonably substantiated tradition, and so I'm going to assume it with that caveat that, you know, in some circles this has been questioned, but nevertheless it was a known place. So we'll assume it. The city dump, it was a place of refuse, stench, and of course, as you can imagine, a constant burning. So if we could hear with the ears of the disciples when Jesus said this, using Aramaic, of course, it wouldn't be the Greek term, but it'd be the Aramaic equivalent of a reference to that place, he would have said something like this: it'd be better for you to enter life maimed than to have two hands and be thrown into the dump where the fire never goes out. Okay, so that's kind of the facial sense of it. The word hell is so loaded with baggage that it sometimes obscures a little bit what's actually going on here. Now hang on to your hats, because I think there's even more to explore about this. But I know you think I'm on the verge of heresy, but just, give me a little more rope and we'll see where we go. This Greek word ge'enon is the Greek name for the Hebrew place called Wadi el-Rababi, which was otherwise known as the Valley of the Son of Hinnom, also known as Tophet. It was a known place, and it was famous, indeed infamous, in the history of the Jewish people, especially there in Judah. It was famous because it was the venue for the most horrific form of idolatry to the Canaanite god Moloch, this most ghastly Canaanite deity to whom human sacrifices were offered. The first king we know of in Judah's history was Ahaz. He'd made his deals with the devil, and part of his sellout was engaging in that kind of almost unspeakable pagan religious practice. And we hear that even he himself offered his own sons there as burnt offerings to the god Moloch. Well, other kings, of course, came along who didn't do that. There were good kings and bad kings. So you have good King Asa, as you know if you know your Old Testament, good King Hezekiah, good King Jehoshaphat, but there were also some other kings not so good sprinkled in. The worst of those wicked kings was a guy by the name of Manasseh, the son of Hezekiah, ruled for about 50 years. And he was really just beyond virtually any imagination as to how vigorously he led the people of God into paganism. Manasseh himself repented, interestingly, at the end of his life, saw the error of his ways, but it was too late. The damage was done. The momentum had been building up, and these folks were running down that track toward their own destruction. And Manasseh really had a lot to do with it. And the centerpiece of the worship that was sponsored by Manasseh and advocated by him was doing this very thing, this unspeakable practice of human sacrifice to this god Moloch. Well, when Manasseh died, his son Amon, 642 BC, took the throne. He only ruled for 2 years. He was assassinated. He was cut out of the same mold as his father, and that brought his son, the 8-year-old Josiah, to the throne. 8 years old, the year 640 BC. Early in the reign of Josiah, that famous prophet in the Old Testament, Jeremiah, was commissioned, 627 BC. So when Josiah was basically just a young man, maybe his late teens, early 20s, the powerful prophetic voice of Jeremiah begins to rally Josiah to become a reforming king, and he does it on steroids. He really takes this thing on with a kind of profound gusto. Well, Jeremiah is the only prophet that we find in the Old Testament who specifically singles out the Valley of Hinnom as a place to be specifically condemned. It was well known, but interesting, it's Jeremiah who uses that as an illustration of how far the people of God have wandered And the text in which Jeremiah does that uses the same language that Jesus uses here, language of cutting something off. Jesus says, if you sense that this thing in which you are taking pride is leading you into sin, you need to cut it off, you see. You need to get rid of it. Probably Jesus had, at least at some level, this text in Jeremiah in mind because it uses that cut it off language. This is in Jeremiah chapter 7. It would have been a message probably when Josiah himself was a young man, maybe 20 years old or so. So God says to Jeremiah, you shall say to them, quote, this is a nation that does not obey the voice of the Lord their God, nor receive correction. This is a people who, though they were commissioned to be a priestly nation, have sold out, and they are not obeying my voice. They are not doing what I've called them to do. They've headed pell-mell into the most deplorable forms of disobedience. Truth has perished and has been cut off from their mouth. This is the nation that was supposed to be trustees of the central sanctuary of the world, a house of prayer for the nations. They were the pastor nation, the priestly nation. They were supposed to be the voice of truth. And at times they were, and at times they had a very positive impact on the surrounding nations. But for the most part, not so much. And now they've really gone over the top in their departure from what God has called them to do. So much so that the truth that they should be speaking has been cut off from their mouth. And then Jeremiah continues, therefore cut off your hair. Cast it away, and take up a lamentation on the desolate heights, for the Lord has rejected and forsaken the generation of his wrath. Now, Jeremiah doesn't say cut off your hand, your foot, or your eye, but he does say cut off your hair, get a haircut. On the face of it, that doesn't quite make sense to us, but the people who originally heard Jeremiah probably got it in a heartbeat. The whole idea of cutting the hair was associated with what was called the Nazirite vow. You know that. There was this special kind of vow a person could take, a man, in his service to God, usually a limited period of time in which he would, by vow or oath, devote himself to the service of Yahweh in some special sense. And during that period, he did not cut his hair, he did not drink wine, he otherwise observed certain personal disciplines that might not otherwise apply. And then the vow would be over. The most famous Nazirite, of course, in the Old Testament was Samson. It was a lifelong Nazirite. When he got a haircut, it had some pretty significant impact, you see, on his ability to serve, because it was open treason against the vow that was otherwise incumbent upon him. Well, when Jeremiah says to these people, cut off your hair, it's a sort of figurative way of saying to them, look, you folks are supposed to be the Nazirites. You're supposed to be that nation that in a special way has devoted yourselves to the service of God, emblemized, figuratively speaking, by your hair, which probably really means just the holiness of your life, the holiness code, as something in which you would normally take pride in a sense, and yet now the irony is that you are the leaders of the most corrupt form of religion, and you still have that hair. You still think you're the chosen people. You still think you have this special status. Get rid of that hair. It's a lie. It has no place. You need to recognize how dreadfully you've departed from your status as those who specially belong. Impair yourself. It's the same idea as Jesus saying to the disciples, cut off that hand. You were proud of it. You thought it gave you access. No, it's tripping you up. It's the thing that's keeping you out. So get rid of it. Cut off your hair, cast it away. Take up a lamentation on the desolate heights. That's what you need to be doing, lamenting. For the Lord has rejected and forsaken the generation of his wrath. For the children of Judah have done evil in my sight, says the Lord. They've set their abominations in the house that is called by my name to pollute it. They've built the high places of Tophet, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, to burn their sons and their daughters in the fire, which I did not command. It didn't enter my mind, you see. And this is the most distinct condemnation of that location that we find in the Old Testament. Josiah took it to heart. Josiah, hearing probably that message and more that Jeremiah said over the years, undertook the most vigorous, reforming, energetic labor of any king in the history of Judah. He specifically targeted the valley of Hinnom. He desecrated it. He tore down every artifact of religion there, and at least tradition says it eventually became the city dump, as if to add insult to injury when it comes to that god Moloch. So far from being a place of worship, we're going to turn it into a place that nobody really wants to visit except to dump off their trash, you see. Now, that, of course, gave rise to an image of this place in the backyard of Jerusalem that was always burning. Sanitation, disposal of refuse, and so on. Smoke always rising off on the horizon in the valley of the son of Hinnom. It's a very interesting thing. In the Old Testament, I think you know, there's not a very robust development of either a doctrine of hell or of heaven. Both of them are left rather obscure. You certainly see hints here and there, but nothing nearly as graphic as the New Testament descriptions. Really, the place of the dead in the Old Testament comes under that broad rubric of Sheol, a kind of dark, mysterious, shadowy place. And beyond that, though there's little glimpses, you know, Job says, I know my Redeemer lives and I shall see him in the last day. You have statements, but really anything like the New Testament is absent. But during the intertestamental period, this valley of the son of Hinnom took on rather proverbial significance, so much so that it worked its way into some of the apocryphal literature of that era and became the emblem of a place of eternal torment. So you don't have that so much in the Old Testament, but you do have it in this intertestamental period, a place of eternal torment, and that comes down as kind of the tradition into the first century. The book of Enoch, for example, chapter 90, and various other places make that identification. Now, here's what's interesting. We know that Jesus has no problem overruling traditions with which he differs. We've seen that. He will overrule and set aside the tradition of the elders, the Talmud. He'll correct that body of writing. He even abrogates part of the Old Testament, setting aside kosher, as you know. We saw that in Mark chapter 7. We would have thought, that Jesus, when confronted with this idea, would have set it aside. Now look, guys, I know you've heard about this place of eternal torment. But hey, I just want you to understand, a loving God would never send people there. That's what we think Jesus is going to do. That's what we expect from him. Because he's certainly capable of correcting misguided understanding. The thing that's so astonishing about Jesus is that he not only doesn't correct it, he juices it up. He takes that particular idea that had come down not really from the Old Testament, but from this tradition, and actually gives more description of that than he does of heaven. We learn more about hell from Jesus of Nazareth than anybody else in the New Testament. Somebody said it's probably because we couldn't take it from anybody else in the New Testament. It had to be Jesus. This is the only time in Mark's gospel the subject comes up, but you know it comes up in other contexts, in Matthew, Luke, and John. And as we look soberly at what is said, we find these really significant warnings that I think any thoughtful person would be inclined to take very seriously. We're certainly not given a lot of detail about what exactly this eternal place is like. We're given images, a lake of fire, weeping and gnashing, outer darkness. They're not very pretty. None of them probably quite get at it. They're all attempts to explain in language we can somehow triangulate something that is dreadful and to be avoided at all cost. But the thing that should really disturb us the most is those warnings tend to be addressed to folks like us. People who may be inclined to be a little proud of our religious status and may have a tendency to look a little bit disparagingly on those we think aren't quite up to our standards. And so it's a profound warning that we are supposed to take to heart. I don't personally think scaring people into heaven by preaching hell is probably a great evangelistic technique. All due respects to Jonathan Edwards, who I love. But it seems to me there may be better ways, to communicate the beauty of the gospel than that. But that it is there in the New Testament, and that it should be taken therefore seriously by God's people, seems to me an unassailable hypothesis. So this warning to us should be strong incentive for us to do a little soul searching when we think about what is it that's causing me to want to boot some people out of this big tent that we call the kingdom of God. All right, I got 20 minutes more of material and 10 minutes to do it in. So here we go. Well, I'm going to make my job easier because verses 44 and 46 were not there in the original text. Some well-intended copyist wrote them in. We do have it in 48, so we'll cover this language. Their worm does not die, the fire is not quenched. But what we do have is Jesus virtually repeating himself 2 more times, saying what is roughly the same language, but applying it in each case to some other aspect of my well-being. So we start with the hand, then I find out if my foot causes me to sin, and finally if my eye causes me to sin. Well, it's been noted on many occasions that in many ways Jesus is sort of identifying the chief areas, kind of the waterfront of my human life and activity and so on. My hand emblemizes, stands sort of figuratively and poetically throughout the scriptures for what I do, my productivity, my life of labor, how I provide for myself, how I provide for those who depend on me. My hand is the symbol of that aspect of my life. It certainly can be something in which I take an illegitimate pride. People can be very proud of their hand and what it does, you see. Especially if what my hand is doing is somehow in a kind of religious activity. That might even incline me more to have this sort of pride about that thing. So Jesus identifies that, not so much telling us to literally amputate your hand, but there is an amputation of the hand that the New Testament contemplates. The Apostle Paul over in Ephesians, writing to people, some of whom were newly converted, says to them, "Let him who stole steal no more. If your life has been a life of a thief, then terminate that. That's a bad career choice. Let him who stole steal no more, but rather let him labor, working with his," what? Hands, "that he may have something to give." The hand that had been used for taking, for pilfering, for thievery, is going to be amputated. It's going to be replaced with a different hand. A hand that is now working legitimately, productively, in order to have something to give. You know, it's an interesting thing. You cannot, at one and the same time, with the same hand, be both a taker and a giver. Can't do it. This is part of what's called in the New Testament the put on and put off motif. You put off a way of life that was contrary to God's call. You get rid of that, but rather than leave yourself in a vacuum, you put on something that by the nature of the case prevents you from doing what you once did. The hand that used to be a taking hand becomes a giving hand. There is a kind of amputation there. If I see in my life something that's causing me to sin, then I need to put that off, amputate that, and put in its place something that by the nature of the case prevents me from continuing in that MO. Same thing with the foot. The foot stands generally for where I go, what my associations are, what clubs do I belong to, what friendships do I have, where do I like to hang out, what's my comfort zone culturally speaking. And if I see that in that part of my life there's something that again is either a source of pride, some people are very proud of the clubs they belong to, you know. Some people, when I was back in Kiwanis days, I had this beautiful red jacket. I loved it. Thought, wear that red jacket, everybody notices you. Well, I don't think I got into too much trouble doing that, but it's possible. It's possible, you see, to be proud of my associations. Where does my foot take me? And if so, then I need to do some amputation there. What about my eye? The eye generally stands in the Bible for what I desire. Where am I heading? What am I longing for? What is my deepest kind of motivation in terms of what I'm trying to get out of life? And again, I may certainly see there things that are militating against my devotion to Christ. All of these become fair game for a little bit of radical surgery if I find in them something that is compromising my devotion to Christ. This text, "The worm does not die and the fire is not quenched," was a famous verse. It happens to be the last verse. The book of Isaiah, 66 chapters, ends with this verse. Chapter 66 of Isaiah is otherwise a prediction of the great benefits, the great blessings that are going to flow out of the work of Messiah in this world. And wonderful, lavish, kind of poetic descriptions are provided there of the way in which the gospel and the work of Christ and the work of His kingdom is going to be of great benefit in this world, growing until a time comes when the knowledge of God covers the earth as the waters cover the sea. And then in that context, Isaiah says people who are living in that great spirit of that great time of blessedness will go out and look upon the corpses of men who have transgressed against me, for their worm does not die, and their fire is not quenched. They shall be an abhorrence to all flesh, period, end of prophecy. That's an interesting place for the prophecy to end. Jeremiah is talking here about the memory of wicked people in time. Candy and I, this past week, got back from a road trip that took us, among other places, through, what is it, Rapid City? Rapid City, Mount Rushmore. Never been there before, got our photo op. It's a great place, You look up there, you see George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson, Teddy Roosevelt. The face I didn't see? Benedict Arnold. Not there. But you all have heard of him, haven't you? His worm hasn't died yet. The fire hasn't gone out. We remember him as Americans. You can go to Germany. You'll look in vain for a city park called Hitler Plaza. There is no such place. But the name lives on. The worm hasn't died. The fire hasn't gone out. Genghis Khan is usually not celebrated too much in monuments around cities. Most folks don't name their kids Judas Iscariot. What a wonderful name to give our kid. You see what I mean? But the name lives on, and in a sense that's the force of what Jeremiah is saying, of what Isaiah is saying here. These people living under the blessings of the Messianic age will nevertheless remember those who died in their wickedness. Their memory will live on in time. Jesus seems to take that principle and tie it to the anguish of wicked people in eternity, ramping it up. St. Bernard says, "The worm that never dies is the memory of the past, which never ceases to gnaw the conscience of the impenitent." And the last two verses of that little discussion are rather unexpected. They seem at the first brush to be somewhat odd, stuck in here at this point, but actually they fit perfectly with what Jesus has otherwise been saying. So this is Mark chapter, good heavens, did I do that? Oh no, that's okay. So this is Mark chapter 9, beginning at verse 49, the last two verses of that chapter, the Word of God. "For everyone will be seasoned with fire, and every sacrifice will be seasoned with salt. Salt is good. But if the salt has lost its savor or its flavor, how are you going to season it? So have salt in yourselves and be at peace with one another. Two images are here in this text: fire and salt. Fire we've just been thinking about. Jesus had said, if something in your life is offensive, get rid of it. It's better to get rid of that and salvage for yourself life than to be thrown into that place where the fire is never extinguished. Generally, we would probably consider that what's sometimes called the fire of justice. We understand that God is a holy God, that He must ultimately be righteous, true to Himself, and thus if there is sin in His universe, He cannot eternally ignore it. He finally has to dispose of sin using the quality of wrath. And that gives rise to this doctrine that we were looking at in some detail of hell. Now, the wrath of God may be extinguished for those who Christ, in the case of those for whom Christ died, the wrath of God in a sense absorbed in Him, so that that wrath of justice is taken away. And this is what we're so grateful for as Christian people. But that doesn't mean there's still not fire out there. And so some have spoken of a fire of justice and also a fire of mercy. And so everybody is going to be seasoned with fire one way or another. Ain't no escaping it, you see. This fire of mercy is, of course, alluded to occasionally in the New Testament. For example, we hear the Apostle Peter saying over there in 1 Peter, "Dear friends, do not be surprised at the fiery trial that you're going through, as if some strange thing were happening to you, but rejoice that you are participating in the sufferings of Christ, so that you may be overjoyed when His glory is revealed." It's part of that suffering leading to glory motif that we've talked about, of course, in Mark. And here Peter is telling us the same thing. There may be a fiery trial, there may be difficulties, there may be challenges, there may be pain. It may sometimes be produced by simply the circumstances of life. It can sometimes be precisely because we're Christians. It may be from a variety of sources, but one way or another, these things are going to happen, and they're going to be for our good. Because Peter also tells us elsewhere in the same letter that just as Jesus suffered in His body, we should arm ourselves with the same attitude, because the one who has suffered in His body is done with sin. So, he continues, He no longer lives the rest of His earthly life for evil human desires, but for doing the will of God. There is something about suffering that makes us get real. The pretense is kind of stripped away. Life gets real up close and personal when we're hurting. When everything's going fine, we can kind of live in a fool's paradise. But when we're hurting, we tend to get real. The one who has suffered in his body is done with sin. In a sense, the self-deception that so easily crowds into our lives tends to evaporate when we're really in pain. That's the point. And so it's good for us. A fire of justice, but also a fire of mercy. This text also makes reference to salt. Commentators have tended to tie these two, fire and salt, to the Old Testament so-called whole burnt offering, because that offering was offered conspicuously as a complete consumption of the sacrifice, and it was offered with salt and plenty of it. And the whole burnt offering sort of stands generally for the idea that we are those who are supposed to be, in a sense, a whole burnt offering to God, nothing held back. Some of the Testament would be eaten later by priests and others, that was part of the regime, but some were just offered, nothing held back, it's gone. And in a sense, that's the kind of sacrifice that we hear of in the New Testament. Paul says, I beseech you that you offer yourselves to God a living sacrifice, that we're a whole burnt offering. giving yourself wholly to Him, nothing held back. So this salt and fire seems to be pointing us in that direction, and in a sense it's extending the point that if anything in you is not wholly given to Christ, if it's not part of that complete whole burnt offering, if your eye is offending you, if your foot's offending you, if your hand's offending, then you got to get rid of it, because there has to be a totality of our surrender to Christ. Now this is a little bit cryptic, I think, but nevertheless it seems that may be something of what is going on here. Mark gives us the words of Jesus. Salt is good. Salt in the ancient world, as you know, seasoned food. Salt also, as you know, was even more importantly used to preserve meat, right? So without refrigeration technology, salt was rubbed into the meat and therefore it preserved it. Because salt therefore had such an important role to play, as you can imagine, there were counterfeiters who produced a sort of fake salt, fool's salt, if you will. It looks like salt, even tasted a little bit like salt, but it wasn't the genuine article. Some people were actually hoodwinked into buying this stuff, and then when they used it, they found out it wasn't the real thing. In the ancient world, they thought salt could lose its saltiness. That's the way it was viewed. That was kind of the excuse. We know sodium chloride doesn't lose its saltiness, but that was kind of the evident reason in the ancient world. But if you came by that sort of substance, then you had something that was useless. As Jesus says, it was thrown out into the street to be trampled underfoot of men. End of story. Now it seems this ties in simply to say this. We need to be rigorous in examining ourselves, lest we become a fake substitute for true salt. This world needs salt, both to flavor life and also to restrain corruption and evil and decay. But when we, in fact, don't really enforce the rigor of self-examination against ourselves, we lose that potent effect in the world. I came across a great quote by an English member of Parliament addressing openly the church in England at a time of national crisis. And he had these words, quote, "If you have anything peculiarly Christian to say at this hour, for God's sake, say it. If you have nothing to say but an echo of what is heard in every street corner, on every luncheon club in the land, then for God's sake, keep still." How many times has a culture needed to say that to the church? Look, what are you guys about? Are you just trying to play Me Too, keeping up with the current fad in the culture, trying to maintain your relevance by becoming colossally irrelevant and saying anything you could hear anybody say in the passing fashions of the morality of the day? Or are you willing to stand up and actually say something that matters? It may make you unpopular, it may subject you to a little abuse in the press, but hey, this is what you're here to do. Which is it going to be? And of course, the church at every juncture in her history has been wrestling with the question, are we going to simply try to be non-offensive and thus lose our saltiness? Or are we prepared to say something that may arouse the ire of popular sentiment but needs to be said in the moment? So Jesus says, be salty. And the way to be salty is to be a whole burnt offering, offered in fire and salt. And the way to do that is to see whether there's something in you that's causing you to sin, causing you to compromise. An eye, a foot, a hand. Is there something there that you need to rigorously excise? In a sense, applying the fire, as it were, to yourself. Paul says, let a man judge himself so that he won't come into judgment. And maybe that's what we're being called to do. He concludes this by saying, have peace with one another. It seems the reason for that goes back to the very beginning of this whole discussion, in which John had said to Jesus, hey, we saw somebody casting demons out in your name, and we stopped him because he's not with us. It's the first denomination, them and us. The insiders and the outsiders. And Jesus says, whoa, hold the phone. If that person isn't openly opposing me, he's on our team. We need to be at peace as Christian people. People who labor under the burden, under the banner of Christ, should be more characterized by the sense in which they are at peace with one another than at odds with one another. I'm afraid that's not a distinct feature of a great deal of Christian expression in the world, is it? We sometimes pray for peace in the world, as we should. Probably it would be helpful if we also prayed at the same time for peace in the church. I wonder, it's a speculation, but I wonder to what degree would we see peace in the world increase if we Christians could find a lot more peace among ourselves. In ancient Israel, there were times when Israel was faithful to her Lord and times when she wasn't. And it's such an interesting study in ancient history to see that when Israel is at peace with herself and faithful to her Lord, the surrounding nations tended to be at peace with her. And I'm wondering whether that might also be our experience if we were to undertake that approach. And we're kicking it up right here. So, lesson number 1, look without. That is, look outside yourself for evidence of service in the name of Christ, and be diligent to support and encourage any such ministry. I love our church because I really think we do this well. Honestly, even though I feel like I'm beating up on you a little bit, you really don't deserve it, because our church has a wonderful culture of recognizing Christian ministry elsewhere, and that's good. We have our faults, but I think at least at that point we're doing okay, appreciating Christian ministry elsewhere, supporting it, joining with it, and so on. But that's our call as Christians. That's no great virtue. It's just the normal task we have. At the same time, lesson number 2, we should look inside ourselves, look within, for evidence of pride and hypocrisy wherever a critical attitude obscures appreciation for any such ministry. When I find myself a little disparaging toward anybody who claims to be laboring in the vineyard on behalf of Christ, I should be on my guard, because Jesus has pretty severe warnings for that kind of inconsistency. And finally, look around for evidence of salt that can season a world bored with its sin. We live in a culture so bored with sin, so diligent to find new ways to get juiced up in sin. It's so boring. And we as salt have the ability to add to that insipid culture something of real spice, and to preserve a world disintegrating in its moral decay.